I'm very good. How are you?
Done quite well actually, considering I've done like a 13-hour day yesterday. So actually no, it's 16 hours. I drove a 12-hour drive from Rotorua down to Wellington, our capital, picked up my second eldest son, and came back up country again. So it's like a 6.5-hour drive one way.
Yeah, you've been busy.
I've enjoyed a really good drive on the open road, yes, in my sports car. So it's been good. Yeah, and we stopped in my hometown of Wanganui and
Hmm.
chased up some ancestors' grave locations as part of my family tree project I'm doing. Um,
Oh, okay. Very nice.
yeah, yeah. So and then came up that way, up the back road. So and now we're preparing to shift this week. So it's all go here in New Zealand. What about
I guess
you?
so. Um, yeah, it's been a little cold in Charlotte, so we've had a little bit of snow, which is not customary for
Oh,
North
okay.
Carolina. So people have enjoyed it, but we've just had a little. We've had winter this year, I guess. We don't often get much winter, so
Okay. Yep. Yep. So what's the degree of temperature for you at the moment then?
I think we're above freezing now. This morning was, is New Zealand on Celsius or Fahrenheit? Celsius?
Celsius.
That's what I thought. So we were -2, -3 degrees Celsius this morning, and we're, probably that above zero today now.
Okay. Yep. So that's not too bad, but I'm glad we're still summer. So when I got to what we call our national park, which is around our central North Island and our
Hmm.
mountain like Mount Raipahu, um, it plummeted quite cold because I was there probably about 8 o'clock in the morning, and that was alpine level.
Uh,
Um, and that was cold traveling through there. But we are sitting, where am I? I'll have a quick look. Um, where I'm located in Rotorua, we're sitting at 18 degrees Celsius at the moment
oh,
and a
okay.
beautiful sunny day.
Yeah, so nice day.
Yes, and we'll be heading towards 23 around 3 p.m., which is our hottest time.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, Ron, I'm going to thank you ahead of time and say thank you so much for joining me again. Um, but I'm really looking forward to learning more about you and your story that led to you be doing what you're doing, because you're the key factor that's led me to doing exactly what I'm doing now. So the spin-off on that is something quite different, and it's almost like paying it forward mentality in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, it's touching to me that I'm inspiring somebody, that typically would inspire me. So I find that reciprocal but awesome. I like
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And to think that we only just crossed paths with just a comment on your one of your posts
yeah,
about
yeah.
the DEI space. And it's led to me I spoke to somebody in France yesterday morning, and I got people lined up for Canada. And something I have found is Canadian government and us here in New Zealand, the common factor is we don't have the governments are tightening up the funding on the interpreters for us deaf. So the
Uh,
availability and the strictness of what can be accessed is getting harder. Again, we don't have the 504 to protect us. And so it's not compulsory for that funding to be, available as such for these kind of things. So for my deaf communities, I'm having to allow them to do a pre-recording. So we won't have the same interaction available, and it excludes them from that, which is really sad. So I'm all ears if you've got people that would in your network that would help us be able to include them in some way. Um,
Sure.
Canada, they said it was a case of supply and demand. Just they put a booking in but couldn't actually get one, which is quite different.
Yeah, I didn't know that about Canada. That's interesting. And I would say, relating to the deaf and hard of hearing community, Joanne, I think you have put me in touch with more people than I maybe had in my network. So you've really
Oh,
expanded that aspect of it for me. So some individuals like Paul Meyer and others, sort of came. I think Paul and I are kind of in the same ecosystem from the talent acquisition and recruiting side,
correct.
but
Yeah.
some of those individuals really came onto my radar as the result of our conversations. And of course, I've reached out to a number of the folks that you put me in touch with as well, to at least connect with them on LinkedIn. So,
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. No, we consider it an untapped community. And it's just so purely from the fact that, you don't know what you don't know.
right,
It's no different, but a lot of people have said to me they don't know how to approach us because they feel not intimidated, but they just don't have that skill set on how to go about it, the different ways of communicating, um, you know, I'm going to say the rules of communication on it. And every, like the American deaf community has its own cultural uniqueness. Us here in New Zealand, we have our own cultural uniqueness, but the varsity between us, like I have no interpreter, but I'm using closed captions. And because my sound memory is from my background of working with American culture, I can understand your accent because I have that reference point where others don't have that reference point and they would need interpreters. So it's all of that difference that's quite, you know, people don't understand that. They just get, oh, you either hear or you can't hear.
right.
And being able to fill in that gap and say, no, we're as vast and as diverse as everybody else. Um, and it's personal preference. So just ask.
Yeah, I think people think of neurodiversity as a spectrum or autism as a spectrum, but there are spectrums, for visually impaired, for deaf and hard of hearing as well. So
Correct.
different types of accommodations can be beneficial, different types of support can be beneficial. And
Yeah.
I think as far as the approach, feeling awkward, I think it's a shame if people are not sure how to approach and they just choose to not approach, right? Like, go in and learn, educate yourself. That's how you're going to learn, is
Yes.
by having those discussions. I mean, I was a little bit intimidated, at times when I've had discussions like this because I wasn't sure, if I would be able to communicate effectively. And obviously, you've been very gracious, but you also have a setup on your end to be able to manage those
Correct.
aspects. So I can see how it could be a little bit intimidating for somebody coming from, a hearing community, and wanting to make sure they don't. Most people probably have good intentions, right? They don't want to offend. They don't want to do something or say something wrong. But at the end of the day, if it just makes everybody not approach each other, that's a shame.
It's been very interesting for me on LinkedIn from because as I mentioned to you last time, I started in May doing this last year, and my network's growing tremendously since. Is the different approaches that everyone does to me. Some choose to use a visual, and it's human nature to seek that connection in some way. So they're trying to do a connection with me, and from their aspect and understanding and perspective of a deaf person. Some will use GIFs and just show me some sculpture work around, that's there in the world. And I'm left here going, what are they trying to say with that? How, sometimes I think I'll leave it for a day and think, how can I go back and ask what were they asking or what were their intention behind that? So it's always, for me, it's always seeking understanding in their approach. Another person, I've had other people called, you still use the term deaf and dumb. And I've gone back and say, I really hope that your country doesn't still refer to that us deaf as dumb in 2025. Um, and then they've come back and they've said, oh no, it was a misunderstanding, so lost in translation. And they use Google Translate. So you've got that natural AI bias going on.
Right.
And then they come back using the word impairment, which is a medical model. So you're left there going, okay, I totally understand the space that this person is in and their level of understanding working with us deaf. So therefore, I can go back and help support them from that point and slowly grow their understanding from there. There's others that say, no, I've had no experience whatsoever, and you'll never hear from them again. Or they'll ask me, when I ask them what experience they've had, how, why do you ask? And I'm sort of left there going, okay, that's a bit ironic. My profile very much says I'm a deaf person. So it's quite an interesting, diverse approaches. And through all of that, I'm getting to adapt my end accordingly and be the version of myself that everybody needs for each person. Yeah. And that's been interesting from the access point of view since starting this. And you'll find the same in other communities as well, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I found it, I think you caught it, but I found it really embarrassing that I held a webinar on accessibility in a hiring process, and the webinar was not accessible for your community, unfortunately, and it's because it was behind the accessibility is behind a paywall for captioning. So I don't
Oh,
I think I don't know if you saw the post. I'll just assume you didn't and then
yeah, I
talk
did.
about it. Okay.
Yeah, I
So
scratched.
yeah,
I saw it a little bit later on. Yeah.
yeah. So Josh Jones came out and really, put a very transparent post and said he had a hard lesson in accessibility. And I sat back and since then in retrospect, I've looked and said, you know what? We probably raised more awareness by that happening than had it
Correct.
not happened. Had it not happened, Josh would have put out a nice post about a great webinar and that would have been the end of it. But it got a lot more engagement as the result of what happened. So while the fact that it was not accessible for anybody that needed captioning, it ended up being a silver lining, I suppose, where we actually got more engagement, raised more awareness as a result of it, which isn't the goal. So I have a webinar in early April for HR.com, and I've already
Okay.
reached out to them and said, is
Yes.
captioning available? I don't want to have a repeat, and they've assured me that it is. It's available for anybody that requires it to select it. So it's something that I'm checking ahead on now because I don't want to have that happen again. It would have been interesting had I done that for the ERE webinar and they would have checked and found out early that that was a problem. Perhaps we could have rectified it. But it's really incredible to think that accessibility is considered a feature to a software company, and they don't think of it as really something that is enabling people to to be able to access the content, but they think of it as an extra feature for a higher level subscription. That was
Yeah.
and you've probably seen it before, but that was enlightening for me. I was like, wow, I had no idea that
Well,
that that
what
that
you
happens.
through that also, there's another layer to that everybody experienced, and especially you and Josh have experienced, is what we experience as a deaf person is when the preparation is not done, um, our purpose and our intention of the meeting anywhere between two people gets distracted and it becomes disability and condition focused first, and us as a person get left in the background. And we have spent all that time and energy getting there, but we're left doing that instead of doing what we went to the meeting for. And so both of you have had first-hand experience on that. And so it's made you, um, for want of, different term, a better person, but you've had first-hand experience as a deaf person.
Because I
um,
think it's
and
with
how it can
technology.
get sidetracked, goes off track. And now you're going to be prepared to keep it on track from the design process.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because technology has advanced and captioning is so widely available. In my mind, I just assumed captioning would be available, right? I didn't specifically ask. But now that
Yeah,
that's happened, I will always specifically ask before I do any sort of a presentation in the future, especially when I'm representing disability inclusion and accessibility. It I don't even know how to process the fact that there was inaccessible aspects to that presentation. Of course, Josh stepped up and afterwards very quickly released the version that did have
yeah,
captioning, so that was great. And then I've also talked to other companies with like new software, new AI technology, and I've observed that there was not captioning on their
ah,
product. If it was like an interview product, and I've said, why don't you offer captioning? They're like, we didn't think about it. So I had one.
yeah,
There's an AI interviewer, like a automated bot interviewer, who they didn't have captioning. So he was at the ERE conference when I spoke in Anaheim, California in November. We met after that, and I learned more about their product. And that was one question that I asked. 2 weeks later, he reached back out and said, "Can we do a demo? We've
mhm,
added captioning." But it was enlightening for them because everything I talk about is all about accessibility and disability
right,
inclusion.
yeah,
So it was on their mind, but they didn't really think of it as hearing people, right? So
yeah,
it was interesting to see them, engage and really jump into it. But I try to spread that wherever I can. But it is interesting because sometimes it's just assumed, with new technology versus double checking to make sure that everybody's included.
yeah. And all this that we're talking about is from hearing to deaf, at the minimum level. The next level would be to include an interpreters. But you think about the videos that we see online, on LinkedIn and different platforms where our deaf community are actually using sign. That technology to take sign to their hearing is not there. So all our deaf community, our influencers, everything, they are sitting there doing double and three times. And I do this when I'm signing and actually putting open captions in. We are sitting there, um, interpreting our own sign videos and adding the captions to be inclusive for you hearing people. So
Yeah,
that, the technology is not there. You just can't switch on auto captions for from sign to spoken yet. Um,
right.
so you think of the double amount of time it takes for us, Steph, to do a sign video and make it inclusive that way. Um, so it's kind of, yeah, look forward to the AI space joining, where it can actually get to that and reduce our work time, but still keeping it inclusive as well. So that's why you see a lot of videos from our deaf without captioning, because it takes a lot of time and effort for them to actually make that run real and put that in there.
Sure. Yeah, it
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah. So a lot of people, you've got that debate about the two, where a lot of people in the hearing say, well, why should we do it if you don't do it?
I saw a really interesting debate between somebody who was deaf and somebody who was autistic on LinkedIn.
Hmm.
It was actually and another individual that I didn't know, and they were debating about accessibility on a video call. And said, for me, accessibility is leave your video on. The autistic person was saying they like to shut their video off because they can absorb information better. And
Yeah,
then the autistic person further said, but for accessibility, if I'm talking, I'll turn on my video. Paul still didn't seem to think that that was fully accessible for him. And I found that interesting that there was sort of in spite of everybody trying to accommodate, there was still sort of a gap there, that I found interesting
and
because I will talk separately about somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing or somebody who's autistic and about what accommodations might look like. But I hadn't considered that there could be a clash in accommodations. And even really maybe something that it's hard to reconcile overall, but that there are clashes that happen in that regard.
That's also an individual preference for a deaf person.
Right. Yep.
Because for me and for other deaf I know here in New Zealand, they'll be okay with that, and we do that quite often. So we can have up to, because we're across the country, but we're one community here in New Zealand, basically. We will have online meetings to discuss law changes and different things, and we can have up to 30 of us in the community on one meeting, and a lot of us will turn on, turn off. We will, we'll have up to 2 interpreters going and swapping over. It's quite a sight to see, actually, how well they've got Zoom, and that came out of COVID, because that was our only way for us to connect as well. And we will turn on, if it's our turn to speak and sign, we will actually turn on our video. If it's not, we will turn it off to reduce the number of open screens so that everyone can see who the speakers are. Whereas somebody who is wanting that on constantly, they will be looking for more context, is something I'm maybe guessing at, because like I say, it's an individual preference. So they may be looking for those non-verbal clues and expressions of what that person is thinking. So you've got what's called an intersection into the two communities. For myself, I would say, yep, sure, no problem. You can keep that turned off, because I would adapt to using the captions if they were speaking with their screen off. Or if I had an interpreter booked, the interpreter would fill that void. But for someone who's non-signing and not au fait with in spoken language so much, then they would be reliant on that facial expressions and everything. So yeah, it's quite different to actually, as a host, to be able to piece it all together.
Yeah, for sure. And it did seem like it was a bit of a personal preference, which absolutely makes sense. At the end of things, and we all have those, right? We all have our preferred
Yes.
way of communicating or what have you. But I just found it interesting that there was sort of an accessibility clash between two different disability segments, and found it fascinating on some level. And it made me realize that an accommodation for one might be, inaccessible for somebody else, which was an interesting thing to I guess process.
Yeah, I get that it's that same kind of thing, and points of view, very strong points of view, sometimes from the young blind community. And I'll say young from about 15 years to about 30-year-olds. They're very strong advocates for their blind accessibility. And the ones that I've experiences from have been from the American community, blind community. And they hold a real fierce advocate towards us deaf. And it just gets to the point where they, I'll nicely and politically and try and engage with them to understand them, where they're coming from. But they have this mindset that anything I say or do, they just can't, it's like they can't face it, so to speak. And I understand it, because with blind, if they lose their hearing, um, it's a really hard space. And for us deaf, if we lose our sight, it's a hard space. So
Absolutely.
I've recently read that book, and I put it up there on my Monday book features about the deaf blind champion. Have you read that one yet, about the Canadian sports ice speed skater?
I saw your post. I haven't read the book.
Yeah, so it does come in audio version, and it's on Audible. But it's a worthwhile one looking at, because he kind of touches on that a little bit in there. How that he didn't always wasn't always blind, but he's at a certain scale where you can see some things, and the deaf part of him, for him to lose his sight, he had to address that, and how he was going to get through it and find his navigate through that experience of losing his sight.
Hmm.
So for me, it was like, right, I totally understand it. We both hold this fear. And even I do. I've got glasses and I sometimes wake up blind due to my neuro condition. So I understand not being able to communicate and being locked in. And I've had to find a way to navigate in those moments. And
Mhm.
so I have sitting on my phone, I have bookmarked, and my son has it on his, the website for the deafblind up sign, which is based on British Sign Language. So if that happens, he can come in and straight away adapt to communicate into my hand with tactile. Um, and that leads me, but it was a partnership, is the point that I'm making. And you have to find a partnership and middle ground in those circumstances.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell me more about your backstory. What actually led you to do what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story, but I think for me, my father was blind my whole life. He has since passed away in 2019, but I grew up and I never knew anything but my father being blind. He never saw me, and that's how he was, my whole life. So I was around his disability, watched him work to navigate an inaccessible world, was his eyes at times, helping him navigate, up and down the street to go to places and so on. But it was just very normal for me. I've also experienced people who encounter somebody blind for the first time. My wife, when my father and mother came to visit many years ago, my father was sitting in the middle of the living room with no lights on, and my wife
Yes.
walked in and said, "Oh, would you like me to switch the light on?" And my dad, of course, always had a great sense of humor, and he said, "If it makes you more comfortable, that's fine."
Oh,
Um,
yeah,
so of course, he was lighthearted about it, but it was something
yeah.
that my wife had never been directly exposed to. So, I grew up. Then when my father was a young man, so he was blinded at 19, in a car accident. Back at
Yes.
that time, they didn't have shatterproof lenses and glasses.
Right.
So when he met another car head on in the middle of a snowstorm, his face hit the steering wheel. It shattered his glasses into his eyes, and that's how he became blind.
Yeah.
He ultimately became the first blind student at Penn State University and graduated with a master's degree in counselor's education, which is, similar to psychology.
Okay.
So certainly saw him, heard stories of him achieving some success. Ultimately, during my teen years, my father was working for the Blind Association that was located in Buffalo, New York, where I was living at that time with my parents. He was working in the paper file folder division where the blind workers would use large machinery to cut paper file folder stock. They
Mm-hmm.
would use machines that would press it and create the little accordion sections,
Yep.
glue the panels on, and ultimately create those nifty file folders that like legal organizations would use.
Okay.
So with that in mind, he was working there for about 10 years, and one day they lost funding and closed that division.
Wow.
So my father was not happy about that and said, "This is not
No.
acceptable," because it's now he's unemployed and so are a series of other blind workers. So he decided that he's going to figure out a way to find funding and reopen this division. So what he ultimately did is he found funding. He bought
Wow.
all of that equipment.
Yep.
He leased a warehouse in another location, moved all that equipment there, started Blind Industries Incorporated, and then reemployed most of the blind workers that had been laid off. And then went on to run that business as the director, president, or whatever for the next number of years.
Out of
So
interest, is that organization still going?
it's not, it's
Okay.
not. I mean,
Yep.
just like with a lot of things like that, everything's outsourced,
Right.
to somewhere offshore like China, or they've figured out a way to make things more cheaply. So unfortunately, it didn't last indefinitely. But seeing my father do some of those things, even simple things like coming home from school, asking my mom, "Where's my dad?" and she's like, "Oh, he walked to the store." And I'm like, "What do you mean he walked to the store? Like that's like 8 city blocks away. Like how did he
Yes.
possibly walk to the store?" So then I ran out and saw him, and then I literally stood by and watched him come to the street corner with his cane, listen to traffic, and and it was before anything was accessible. Nothing was blinking or beeping or speaking to anybody right at the street corner. So he
Yes.
had to do it all based on just his God-given senses. So would see him do some of these incredible things, and I think that made an impression on me. So through the years, I fell into recruiting and talent acquisition, ultimately leading and heading talent acquisition for some companies.
Hmm.
And I became aware that individuals, and in fact, there was a unique experience where we had a candidate who was deaf that was requesting accommodations. It created a
Yes.
real scramble at the company that we were working at because we didn't really have a process. So I
Right.
thought, wow,
Yeah.
that's a
Interesting.
shame that we don't. So that inspired me to begin to, because of my personal side, began to
Yes.
inspire me to implement some accessible features within our hiring program, which namely was a way to request accommodations and then a process for what do we do when somebody says, I'm gonna be showing up on this interview with my sign language interpreter, or
Yep.
I need captioning, or I need something else. What does the recruiter do? So we set up processes to do that. Along the way, around that time, of course, then I had a family of my own. My wife is dyslexic with ADHD. My
Okay.
daughter is dyslexic. I have a son who struggled significantly through school with ADHD to the point where he almost got added to the United States terrorist watch list because
Oh,
the law enforcement officer at the school thought, based on a lot of his actions and dumb things
yes.
that kids do with their friends, things they shout in the hallway, thought maybe that he sympathized with terrorists. That was back in the mid 2010s when social media started to become a recruiting ground for terrorist groups.
Uh-huh. Yes.
So with that as a backdrop, he's gone on to be successful, and I can tell that story, but I'll kind of shortcut to kind of where what got me
Yeah.
to today, and we can talk about any of those other elements. So I would say in 2017ish, I kind of got in knee deep. I call it. I got in knee deep with beginning to implement accessibility into hiring programs where I worked.
Right.
Um, then I left that company, so I'm at Avanti today. In 2022 at Avanti, I had a UX manager at the company who is dyslexic that started this accessibility club called Curb Cuts. That was her and about 3 or 4 other UX designers. She
Okay.
approached me one day and said, "Do you realize that our career site is eliminating people with disabilities from our applicant pool?" And I thought, And I also thought that can't possibly be true. Here
Yeah.
I am. I'm somebody who fancies myself sensitive to these topics and building accessibility. And we had a way to request accommodations on all of our job descriptions and so on. Well, they demonstrated how not only was our career site not accessible, but our entire corporate website had no accessibility functionality. So if somebody was navigating through a keyboard, if they needed assistive software like a screen reader or otherwise, they were completely unable to navigate our website.
Wow.
So that
Yeah.
that blew my mind, and I thought I'm going to do something about this. I
Yeah.
had created a relationship internally with our website team to do work on our career site. I
Mm-hmm.
leveraged those relationships. Within about 2 weeks, they unlocked accessibility functionality on our website. So we now at least had some functionality there. Came through that journey, and in May of last year, we officially tested as ADA compliant.
Okay.
So so there was that, and then in parallel with that, I was also beginning to say, hey, I want to do more than this.
Yeah.
I'm doing a lot of work with my company, but I need to do more because I need to get the word out to other talent acquisition leaders, other HR leaders, because we're uniquely positioned to make an impact from where we sit. We're not just one hiring manager trying to make a difference for one person they're interviewing. we're over
Yeah.
the people program, we can actually make an impact. So that's when I began to do outreach to different state and local government. Um, all the work we've done ultimately led to an award win in the state of Utah. I won an award from my local area in the Carolinas, an HR Standout Award. You've probably seen a lot of that on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
But with that being the case, that's sort of what led me to getting into this. So I would say um, helping my family navigate that inaccessible world, including my neurodivergent family,
Yeah.
where we had to fight for those accommodations. Accommodations, as you know, are often granted, but am I actually receiving them? Are they actually
Yeah.
working the way that they're telling us? So we had to fight for my daughter to make sure she was getting separate setting for testing and read aloud because she's dyslexic, and had to fight for my son to not be labeled as just a bad person because he has ADHD. So, through all of that process, I connected that inspiration or that determination with how I can make a difference in the workplace for people with disabilities. And that's where this has kind of blossomed into what it is today. It's
Yeah.
taken on a life of its own a little bit. And I would say I'm just obsessed today with making a difference in the workplace for people with disabilities.
Out of that journey from not having an accessible website and hiring process to where you are now, what would you say are some of your largest takeaways for somebody watching this? Um, to what did you learn that you've held on to since from that?
So one is that this doesn't cost money. You don't have to go find a budget to do this.
Yep.
I learned a new one. I call it, we did it for the price of free 99.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Yep.
but it was all free. Now my company
Yes.
has invested some money and built classrooms for blind students in India and things like that with accessibility software and hardware. But overall, one big takeaway is this doesn't require a budget. You can
Yeah.
make an impact just by evolving the way you do things, by thinking of things through a universal design perspective. That would be number one. The other thing I'd say by far and away, the biggest thing that I've done is raise awareness and bring visibility to the lack of accessibility.
Yeah.
Doing that has really done more than anything else. I would tell anybody, any company, any HR leader, any business person is raise awareness. So, just like that webinar that we talked about, that was a webinar on accessibility, but it was inaccessible for the deaf and hard of hearing community, which was
Correct.
embarrassing for me. I mean, finding that out live on the webinar was embarrassing.
Yeah.
Um, However, it's raised awareness, and raising that awareness is really what will prevent those situations from happening in the future. And it's not always about investing the big money, getting the big logo, the certification, affiliation with some organization. It's making an impact where you sit, because you
Yeah.
can make a big difference, and raising awareness is by far and away the most important thing to do.
Now, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and say, leading on to that, what would you say to businesses in your area with the DEI, with that pressure that's coming down? How would you combat that? And, I'm saying feel free to answer politically or keep yourself in there. But for people from that design process, because a lot of people, there's so much, I'm going to say, noise happening on both sides of that on the social media waves. What would be a message you'd say to businesses that are looking to be inclusive, but not get offside with what's actually going on, where it affects their business?
Yeah, I mean, I think the regulations are fairly specific towards companies that are measuring things, and they have like targets, like we need to hire this many of this disability sector. Those are a lot of the things that are being kind of frowned on, or they're
Yep.
removing legislations or laws. The good news for the disability segment and for veterans is that that's still protected in the U.S. Obviously, under the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 for people with disabilities, which is where 504 and 508 for digital side
Yeah.
comes into play. So that hasn't changed today. So from my standpoint, I'm hopeful that the removal of some other aspects of DEI from companies where they might not be quite as focused, perhaps we now can take disabilities, move
Yep.
it from charity over to how can we make an impact in the workplace. So maybe there's a little bit of extra room where companies who are seeking a way to continue the DEI journey, but maybe do it in compliance with whatever regulations are, whatever protocols are out there, perhaps with influence of all of us and all of our voices, we can see companies that are kind of moving this over from the charity category, because that's, in my view, what happens when we say
Yeah.
that only 5% of employers are including disability in their diversity efforts. It's really because it's not because companies don't care and people at those companies don't care. I have yet, Joanne, to talk to anybody, whether I'm talking to a business leader, somebody that's part of the disability community, somebody who's in some other role. I haven't talked to anybody who hears my story and says that's a dumb idea. Nobody has ever said that.
That's
Everybody's always
interesting, eh?
supportive of it.
Yeah.
Everybody's always supportive. They just don't know how to take the inspiration or the empathy and apply it to real programs. So what I'm
Correct.
trying to do is show people how, from the people with disabilities in the workplace perspective, how you can apply it to real programs and how you can begin to change the mindset to think from the universal design perspective. Let's not just do the bare minimum to create a ladder to climb up to the roof. Like, let's create an elevator that everybody can use, simple
Yeah.
adjustments like that, where we can begin to think differently. And really, that's what the raising awareness does, is it helps people think a little bit differently. I spoke at an employer workshop last year as part of some of the community outreach I've done in the state of Utah. It was at the Division of Services for the Blind and Visually Impaired. I mentioned earlier how, my father sitting in a dark room
Yes.
caused my wife to say, should I turn on the lights? Well, guess what?
Yes.
When we were getting a tour at the Division of Services for the Blind, we walked into like a computer lab, and there
Uh-huh.
were 6 or 7 people milling around in there with the lights off. And everybody that wasn't me was like, what's going on? Like, why are the lights off? Well, guess what? Flipping the
Yeah.
light on was accessibility now for us seeing people.
That's it.
But it was something that was completely unusual for most of the people that were in that group. For me, it was what I used to experience every day. So for me, it was very normal, but it brought visibility and raised awareness for that group. So it's really interesting how that happens. And I find that it's it's not hard to inspire people. I talk to others that are on the speaking tour, with different disability communities, and they're like, I inspire people and people get excited, but we really want to get people to where they're hiring us. We don't want to be just your inspiration. And I know we
Yeah.
talked about that before. So I'm trying to be that mortar between those bricks to say, here's how we take that inspiration, that empathy that we feel, and how we build it into a real program to make an impact for people in the workplace.
Yep. As you're saying that, my visualization of what you've just done is, the empathy and the charity side is the disability first. And they see that first, and they see somebody that has that, and the person second. By actually bringing in what you're doing, you're in some sense flipping the narrative to being person first, which brings it underlined with the PWD. Instead of a disabled person, you're looking at a person with disability, and you're becoming that person focused first. And you know, and that's what HR and everything in business is it all about people. And then enabling that access, you're actually putting, what I stand for is putting the disability second, last, or never, and enabling that person and seeing that person for who they are. And it makes their disability or their condition a characteristic of them, whether, short hair, long hair, color of skin, all of that. It's just a part of them. And it's, takes that whole focus down to what we should be. We're all human. We're all on that same starting point, and we're all trying to do the same thing, which is enjoy a really good life somewhere along the way, with different stories. Yeah.
Right.
So it's interesting to see how that your viewpoint and what you do And what I'm doing by gathering all those stories actually all fits in to do, we're doing the same thing, but we've got our own, I'm going to say niche. The old term was niche, we've niched down to it, where the old term was to specialize. And, what we can do for that whole advocacy of accessibility and diversity, isn't it?
Yeah. And we have something else that I encourage companies that are interested in this, or individuals that are interested, is start an accessibility group or club, or ERG.
Yes.
They're often called employee resource group. So we have an accessibility club called Curb Cuts at our company,
Okay.
which is aptly named, of course, referring to the cutouts at the corners of the streets that are helping individuals
That's
in
right.
wheelchairs or otherwise navigate, right? So we call it Curb Cuts. And the individual that started that is that pesky UX manager that told me that our website was eliminating people with disabilities.
Yep.
So I got involved, when I found out about that club. So we relaunched it. So it started out as like 5 people with this woman Gianna leading it. Now we just had a meeting with 125 people from the company.
Okay.
So talk about raising awareness and making an impact. And during these calls, it's incredible because this particular call, we had a speaker. So next meeting is going to be training on disability access, which is going
Okay.
to be rolled out to all of those individuals from a government entity that I've partnered with in the state of Utah.
Yep.
The most recent meeting was about neurodiversity. So we had somebody in the UK that presented to us, sort of talked about her journey, her challenges, and everything. What keeps happening in these meetings is when we're talking about disabilities, so many people speak up and say things like, I was never comfortable talking about the fact that I have a disability, or I never disclosed I
Yes.
had a disability until I worked here because I
Yes.
feel comfortable talking about it. So when that first started to happen last year, I sat back and said, wow, we just created a safe space for people to talk and to
Correct.
disclose, because we all know that 75% of our global workers with disabilities don't tell anybody, right?
Yes.
Only roughly 25% disclose it. So we're now creating a benefit for our employees, because if we have 100 employees with disabilities, it's probably 400. So
Yes.
now we're creating a safe space where, not just for new hires and people that are looking for a job, but also for those individuals that are working at the company, creating a better environment. And then the individuals that are part of this, that are advocates or allies, are getting a lot of benefit out of it, because they're like, wow, I never realized. And now they're looking at the world very differently as well. So it's been
Yeah.
really interesting. So I encourage companies to also create a club. And if it's only 2 people, that's okay. Create it as 2 people, and then get the message out, talk about this stuff, look at your physical accessibility of your brick and mortar locations, look at your digital accessibility. For us, digital accessibility is our website, but it's also our software products. So I've
Right.
been engaging our engineering teams about ensuring accessibility of our software and products. I've got the Division of Services for the Blind in the state of Utah, who also help do testing on our own website,
Yep.
willing to help with our software products. So, because in my mind, I'm like, we can use all these software and tools to test accessibility, but what better way to test it than to have somebody using assistive software actually test it? So
That's right.
we're leveraging all of those partnerships and really raising a lot of awareness. But I think there's a lot of benefit to creating an ERG focused on, the disability sector. There's lots of ERGs, for women in technology, for people of color, and all of these other categories, which are great, but you seldom see them here.
Yeah.
And I've since become aware of a couple of other companies, which is really exciting, that have these types of ERGs. So
That's fantastic. So I'm looking forward to seeing your next webinar. Do send me a link, post a link that I can share out to everyone. But we're just about at the end of our meeting tonight, and my morning. Um, what is one thing that you want people to take away from this to do? Would it be to start their own curb cuts in their businesses, or to read? What would you be? Where's the starting point for them?
Yeah, I would just say research, understand, depending on what perspective you're coming from, if you're an advocate or ally, if you're somebody in the disability community. I think it really, the raising awareness, bringing visibility. I say it all the time. Any podcast I do, you'll hear me talk about it. And I
Yeah.
say it too much. And I told somebody recently, I don't say raise awareness and bring visibility because I have nothing else to say. It's because
Yes.
it's literally the most important piece. And I've never seen ex- anything like I've never seen anything accelerate disability inclusion and accessibility, accelerate inclusion more broadly, like accessibility and disability inclusion has, because
Yeah.
we all know it creates a better environment for everybody. But I've never seen anything accelerate inclusion as much as the accessible environment that we've created here at Avanti. So I definitely think raise awareness, bring visibility. Also, don't look at this as they people joke about, you can eat an elephant one bite at a time. Don't look at the big picture. Start with small things. Start by adding an email address to your job descriptions where somebody can reach out to you if they need, accommodations for the best interview experience. Start interviews with, hey, before we begin, is there any way we can optimize this interview experience for you? For
Okay.
somebody without a disability, it might be like, hey, would you mind if I go fill my water glass? For
Yeah.
somebody with a disability, it might be like, hey, I'm struggling, my captioning isn't working, can you give me just a minute? So if we
Yes.
start out with understanding universal design, we can make a big impact. So don't try to start too big. Accessibility clubs are certainly great because that think tank will inspire others to be part of it. And
Yeah.
then consider ways that you can build from a universal design perspective.
Thank you so much, Ron. I really appreciate it. And like I say, I look forward to our next chat and see what we can help people get started on as well.
Absolutely.
All right. So thank you.
Yep, it
Bye
was
for
great
now.
to connect with you. Thanks so much, Joanne.
Same
Bye
again.
bye.
Bye.